Hello there, and welcome to Labour Media. You've probably heard a myriad misconceptions about socialism from outside the movement. Communism doesn't produce innovation. Socialism is when the government does stuff. Vladimir Mao Stalin killed the population of the earth 27 times over. I plan to perhaps get to these claims at some point, but today we'll be looking at something that's more of a misconception within socialism, something many otherwise principled socialists believe despite it being entirely false. Today we're going to be talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, what it is, and why the idea that it is revisionist is itself revisionist. Onwards. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a class dictatorship. It doesn't refer to an individual seizing power wholly, but of the working masses seizing power. Every stage of historical materialism involves a class dictatorship. Currently, within liberal democracy, we live in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The system of liberal democracy is rigged to uphold the bourgeois class. Media outlets and parties are financed and owned by capitalists. And even if a socialist party is to win past all the struggle of red tape and propaganda, they'll still be impeded by institutions and from attack via foreign powers, such as within many movements in the Americas. This doesn't mean voting is entirely useless. What it does mean is that parties should work outside the system and focus on extra parliamentary efforts whilst trying to take on local races, using electoralism to spread propaganda and gain new members. The dictatorship of the proletariat is much the same. The abolition of the bourgeois state and the subsequent institution of a proletarian state gives the people a monopoly on power, a monopoly to the majority in society. The special repressive forces of the state, prisons, police, etc. are destroyed and rebuilt as agents of the proletariat to suppress the bourgeoisie, the minority class in society. It is now the people who possess the means of production and who hold the power of the state. Now, the majority class can suppress the minority class. The need for any repressive forces is given cause to wither away. This is the base with which the proletarian state withers into communism. Now we know what the dictatorship of the proletariat is, we can attack the greatest myth surrounding it. The idea that the idea was abandoned by Marx and Engels following the Paris Commune. The old story goes like this. Following the fall of the Paris Commune, Engels and Marx made a sole addendum to the Communist Manifesto in 1872, keep that date in mind for later, stating that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. This part is true. What is false, however, is that this statement is in any way a revision of the concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat. An oft-told tale is that it was at this moment Marx gave up on the idea of a proletarian dictatorship, and the idea that it is important is a Leninist revision. This is far from the truth, however, for a number of reasons. What's important to note is the phrase ready-made. These two words have been completely ignored by those wishing to distort its meaning. The dictatorship of the proletariat was never about taking over the bourgeois state, it's about replacing it. The bourgeois state is not a state that can wither away, but a proletarian one can, because it suppresses the bourgeois minority. Marx says as much in 1871 in a letter to Ludwig Kugelmann. If you look at the last chapter of my 18th Brumaire, you will find that I declare, lovely rhyming there Marx, that the next French Revolution will no longer attempt to transfer the bureaucratic military apparatus from one hand to another, but to smash it, and this is the precondition for every real people's revolution on the continent, and this is what our heroic party comrades in Paris are attempting. This destruction of the bourgeois state involves numerous elements, such as an end to parliamentarism, the development of each worker into a bureaucrat so that bourgeois bureaucracy is destroyed, the paying of state officials with workers' wages, the replacement of a standing army with a force of armed workers, and democratic centralism that gives farmers' cooperatives, trade unions, progressive societies, and the average proletarian the ability to participate in politics unbound by bourgeois red tape. It is why I and many other MLs oppose the Morponite slogan, "We need a government of action to fight for working families." It is a Kautskyite social democratic slogan that suggests a replacement of governments within the bourgeois system rather than the destruction of that system. It is to meet the proletarian halfway rather than to liberate them. If this doesn't convince you that this 1872 preface was advocating for the dictatorship of the proletariat, there's greater evidence yet. Marx advocated for it outright as late as 1875, after the preface was written. Quote from his Critique of the Gotha programme. The question then arises, what transformation will the state undergo in communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain in existence that are analogous to present state functions? This question can only be answered scientifically, and one does not get a flea hop nearer to the problem by a thousandfold combination of the word people with the word state. Between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. 3 years after the preface advocating for the dictatorship of the proletariat was written, Marx continued to advocate for it, now in much more explicit terms. I hardly need to explain that Engels, co-author of the preface, was in favour of the dictatorship of the proletariat, for that just read his work On Authority, also written in 1872, which makes his opinion on the matter very clear. In conclusion, the dictatorship of the proletariat has been subject to 2 forms of revisionism, the major one being that it was revised by Marx, and a minor one being that it refers to seizing the state instead of organising the proletariat as the ruling class and thereby smashing the bourgeois state. Both have been debunked here by thorough quotations by Marx attached with relevant dates to show that the chronology of when these remarks were stated. The Marxist position is not a statist one. It is one that creates a dictatorship of the proletariat to suppress the bourgeois, wither away into communism. Thank you for watching. As always, the transcript will be available. You get it, yada yada, transcript description. I talk very quickly. Also, in the description will be links to the pieces sourced today, as well as Lenin's State and Revolution, which is one of the best pieces of theory I've ever read. I have to recommend it to everyone, basically. I mean, don't start with it, but it is mwah. Yeah, it is lovely jubbly. I should make some sort of recommended. I'll remind me to do that. But yeah, so basically a lot of quotes I got today were from that book. So yeah. What else? Okay, so as for the next videos, I'm thinking of I had an idea. So I believe the next video will probably be on some political tests, because the one on political compass went down pretty well, and I'm thinking of doing some on some other tests. So probably like Stapley values, left values, maybe the axes test. And I might also have a broadcast interruption where we go over those tests. Well, not live, but you know what I mean. Thinking of doing that. So yeah, lovely jubbly. What was I thinking about? Give me a minute, I'm losing the plot. Oh, that's right. This has been Labour Media, and remember, Labour conquers all.